Okay, hi, welcome back for another video. I'm not exactly sure what the title of this video is going to end up being, but overall in this video I'm going to kind of be doing a 2023 reading wrap-up combined with my top 10 reads of 23, combined with kind of a looking forward to 2024, what my reading goals are for this year, and kind of what I'm looking forward to in 2024 as well. Apologies for the lighting. I do live in Seattle and it is winter and it is always dark by the time I get back from work. This is kind of what we're working with here. I also have my laptop here, which I'm sure is not helping out with the lighting overall, but as I kind of have a lot of information that I wanted to go through in this video, I have my laptop with me today. So yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so my first thing I wanted to talk about was kind of my 2023 Wrapped. So kind of just a summary of all of the reading that I did in 2023. So overall this past year I read a total of 94 books. I was trying to make it to just a nice 95 and I just did not quite get there. But overall I had a really good reading year. I really enjoyed a lot of the books that I read. At the beginning of the year, I had set my Goodreads goal of 50 books, which I knew I would likely exceed because I think in 2022 I read like 83 books or something like that. But I didn't want to set it to like a stressful amount of books. I wanted it to be something very achievable, but that would still encourage me to read a lot of books. So I'm very happy with the number that I read. I had a really good reading year overall. I a little bit towards the end of the year was like, can I just make it to 100? And then I just kind of thought there's no point in pushing myself to make it an unenjoyable reading experience just to try to get through as many as possible. I wanted to still be reading books that I would actually enjoy and taking the time to enjoy them. So yeah, overall 94 books read. I did the little, let's see, what was it called? I did the like my year in books. I saw people doing several variations of this. I did the one that's like myyearinbooks.com and you copy over your like Goodreads handle and it gives you kind of a summary of your reading throughout the year. So I'll pop mine up either here or here. And overall it says that I read okay, let me back that up. On Goodreads in general, it said that I read 37,720 pages. That's kind of hard to gauge anything off of. This says that I read about 64,117 minutes, which I calculated is about 44 days. So I basically spent over a month, almost a month and a half of this year reading, which I would say a pretty enjoyable way to spend over a month. And was pretty surprising. I think a lot of that is due to the fact that I do listen to a lot of audiobooks along with reading physical copies of books. So I always have a physical book I'm reading, sometimes two that I'm reading, as well as an audiobook, and I'm able to listen to it a lot while I work. So that does help me get through a lot of extra books every month. Additionally, this website quantified the number of different genres that I read. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily seems the most accurate to me. It says that the top genre that I read was romance. It says 40 romance books, 37 contemporary, and 34 mystery. I would not at all say I read the most romance books. Probably I read maybe one a month, plus or minus every month. So my best guess is that some of these books, for example, like some fantasy books that I have read, are also listed as romance because there's a romance element. Because a lot of the books I read, even if they aren't romance, there is some romance element within there. So maybe that's how I got my top genre of being romance, which I definitely would not say is correct in what I feel like I read the most or what I enjoy. I definitely feel like I mostly read literary fiction and mostly enjoy literary fiction, but who knows, I was surprised to see that. My reading vibe is eclectic. I don't know what else to say about that. And it also just lists a few of the 5-star reads that I had throughout the year. Actually, I think the only one of these 3 that are showing up here that I actually gave 5 stars is Crown of Midnight. The way that I rate things on Goodreads, because Goodreads doesn't let you give half stars, you can only give 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. And so sometimes if I want to give a book a half star, I'll either round up or round down and then just like write in my comments what my actual review was. So I'm assuming with like Heir of Fire and Assassin's Blade, I gave them 5 stars, but I wrote underneath that it was 4.5 stars because I'm pretty sure I didn't give either of those two 5 stars. Yeah, so it's not necessarily the most accurate way to track everything on Goodreads, but I've enjoyed being able to look back at the books that I've read throughout the year on there. And this was interesting to do, especially to see the minutes read that they estimated. I'm not exactly sure how, like, what speed of reading they used to calculate that, but definitely interesting to see. Okay, yeah, so that wraps up my kind of like 2023 wrapped as far as some overall stats. And then the next thing that I wanted to get into was my top books of 2023. So I saw a lot of people doing videos that were like the top 23 books of 2023. A lot of those people had read like hundreds of books, so I feel like it was a bit easier for them to pick out their top 23. I don't know, I feel like that's just too many books for me to list out from over this past year, but I do have 10 that I listed as my top, as well as I'm gonna like briefly just mention a few kind of honorable mentions at the beginning. And these honorable mentions were not necessarily 5-star books. I think some of them, or at least one of them was, other ones were not. But these are just ones that for some reason have really like stuck with me. I was looking through all of the books that I've read this year, kind of just scrolling through my Goodreads year in review to pick out my top 10. And these are a few that I was like, oh, that's for sure not in the top 10, but like I think about that book a lot, or I just have like super fond memories of reading that book, so I would still recommend them as well. So I have, let's see, 5 books on my honorable mention, so I guess in total I'll be talking about 15 books in this video. So quickly, my honorable mention books that I have on this list. The first one is The Grace Year, and I'll insert a little picture of all of these. And The Grace Year is kind of a dystopian, young adult, very quick read. And I think I talked about it in a past video, so I won't really go into a description. But this one I just really enjoyed, and I feel like I have weirdly fond memories of reading this book despite how kind of like dark and eerie it is, especially for a young adult novel. But I would definitely recommend, especially if you were someone that really enjoyed all of like the dystopian books growing up. I think this is a new one that's come out that was very interesting to read. The next book that I have on my honorable mentions list is The Light Pirate. And this book is actually one that doesn't quite apply to like that I think about it often. I actually don't really think about this book that often, and I gave it 4 stars, but when I was scrolling through the books I read, I was like, I feel like I really enjoyed my reading experience of this book, even if it wasn't a 5-star read. So briefly, this one is about kind of like end of the world, climate change is leading to the end of the world, so it's another type of like dystopian type world, I guess. And I think you're mostly, again, this I read a while ago, so I don't completely remember the plot, but I think you're mostly following this one girl through kind of just her experience of all of Florida becoming underwater and her trying to survive. And then the next book I have on my honorable mention list, this is a book I actually gave 5 stars, but I don't know, for some reason I feel like it still doesn't belong in my top 10, even though some of the books in my top 10 I didn't necessarily give 5 stars. I think I really enjoyed the book, but for some reason it just doesn't stand out as a top 10, and that is Song of Achilles. Again, I talked about this in a recent video, so I won't go over that one again, but pretty self-explanatory with the title. It's kind of a Greek mythology retelling that I really enjoyed. The next book that I have on my list, I think I read in December, so I don't think I've actually talked about this one in a video yet, but that is Talking at Night. This one really reminded me a lot of like the Sally Rooney type books, where there's not necessarily a real plot, or there's not the normal plot of like you get to a climax and then things are resolved or something like that. It kind of just followed the lives of these 2 people, a boy and a girl, grew into a man and a woman, and they're kind of like the way they stayed in each other's lives and left each other's lives and came back together. And it's kind of a romance, but a very realistic, real-life version of what that could look like when you kind of have like childhood crushes and what that person might become in your life. And I really enjoyed it. I think I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. It did get a bit slow at times, but overall I definitely think that was close to being in my top 10 books of the year. And then the last book that I had in my top 10 books of, the last book I had before I get to my top 10 books of 2023 that's on my honorable mention list is the Hotel N Tucket. This is the first Elin Hilderbrand book that I had ever read, and I really enjoyed it. This one is about a woman that takes over a hotel, and she's trying to get it to a 5-key, I believe it is 5-key review by this very well-known hotel reviewer. There's lots of details I'm forgetting since it's been a while since I've read it, but I really just remember loving the reading experience of this book. I think I ended up giving it 4.5 stars. I also listened to the audiobook of this. This is not one that I physically read, and I really enjoyed the audiobook reader. I think that is maybe part of what like helped me really like have this book stand out for the years, that I sometimes when there's a great person reading the book and it's just so nice and relaxing to read, I think it boosts it for me, and it's hard to compare that to reading the physical copy of the book. But either way, I think this was a really great book that really combined elements of romance and mystery and just literary fiction all into a really great book, but not quite in my top 10. Okay, so now I'm going to get to my top 10 books of 2023. Okay, so the first book I have on my list of top 10 books of 2023 in 10th place is Love in Other Words. And I'm sure most of you have heard about this book. I feel like this has been one of those like pretty popular trending romance books, so it's now a few years old at least, I believe. And this book is, as I might have just mentioned, a romance book. It's kind of like friends to lovers, but like lost friend relationship. They're kind of going back and forth between when they were kids and started a relationship to when they're adults, and now they've kind of lost touch with each other, and you're kind of learning what happened in their past relationship that made them lose touch. Can they build this romance back up? I think this one just really stood out to me as definitely my top romance read of 2023. And any other romance book that I read did not all stand up to it, and I feel like this one didn't have very many elements of like the cheesy romance read. So I compare most books that I read to this book, and then it's also very similar to Every Summer After, I believe is the correct. I know there's 2 books by Carly Fortune. I think Every Summer After is her first book that I really enjoyed. But these 2 books are super similar. I feel like every single romance book I read, I'm comparing it to that one and thinking, I don't like it as much as Love in Other Words or Every Summer After. So I feel like Love in Other Words, which I think I slightly preferred, definitely has to be on my top 10 books of 2023 list. Next up, number 9 on my list is Homecoming. Again, I won't talk about this book too much because I know I talked about it in a past video, but this one takes place in Australia. It's kind of a mystery thriller, but also like a girl just discovering her family's history and past, and those 2 things are intertwined. I think there's also a little bit of a romance element to it. I could be making that up, but yeah, I think this one was a really enjoyable overall like literary fiction but exciting read. And then the next book that I had on my list, coming in at spot number 8, was Finding Me by Viola Davis, and this was her memoir. This one was an amazing, very impactful book to read, very educational, very just like eye-opening to the conditions that some people grow up in. That is very far from what I grew up in. So I think it was just very enlightening to read. And I would definitely recommend that anyone read this book. I listened to the audiobook of it, and she actually reads it herself. And so I would definitely recommend, if you're an audiobook reader, listening to the audiobook, because it's really cool to hear her actually like telling the story of her life in her own voice. Next on my list, coming in spot number 7, is None of This Is True. This was probably my favorite thriller that I read in the year of 2023. I think I really enjoyed this one because I read a lot of thrillers this year. Looking back, I was surprised by how many I read, and I feel like so many of them, even though I enjoyed a lot of them, they followed a very similar kind of plot that was so predictable once I'd read that many of them that I just would get so tired of, like, I know what's gonna happen. Even if I don't know what's gonna happen, I know, like, generally the theme we're gonna follow. This one I feel like really broke out from that general theme and had elements of surprise that I didn't necessarily expect. I know some people don't really like how the book wrapped up. I personally found it satisfying and enjoyed it, so I guess take that as you will, and definitely let me know in the comments below if you've read this book, what you thought of the ending without giving any spoilers to anyone, and definitely give it a try and see what you think. But I really liked this thriller. The next book on my list, coming in at number 6, is The Alice Network. This is one that I kind of had forgotten that I read this year until looking back, but I really enjoyed it at the time. Once I was thinking back to it, I was reminded how much of a fan I was of this book. This is, I think it kind of blends in because I read a lot, or especially in the past have read a lot of different like World War II, World War I historical fiction type books. So sometimes in my head they start to kind of blend together and I forget which one is which. This one definitely stands out to me. This one is about a group of women who go and work, I believe it's during World War II, at this kind of, I don't know what the correct word is, at this camp, at this location, where pretty much what's happening is they are interpreting like German codes and trying to figure out the meaning of the codes to use that to win the war. And initially, I don't think any of the women are actually working on code breaking. They're kind of just working in these different roles, but they're kind of just getting their eyes open to like what working for the war effort is like. And then I think one of them in particular is especially like really smart, and she starts to kind of show her value in being really useful and being able to help in breaking these codes. This one was very good. There's also some very sad points of the book. I think one of the things that I remember really enjoying about the book is that like there was one part that was very sad and almost made me want to tear up, and I don't cry when I read books, so if a book does well enough to make me feel like that sad, then they probably did a good job writing. Okay, the next one on my list, coming in spot number 5, is A Little Life. This one, another sad book. Another book I talked about in past videos not too long ago. As I mentioned in that video, make sure before you read this book you look up trigger warnings if you're someone that generally wants to check those, because there is pretty much any topic that could need a trigger warning is in this book. It is very sad to read, very depressing, but also so interesting, and I think so well written. I feel like either people love or hate this book. I'm definitely in the camp of loving the book. I think I just like sadder books sometimes in general. So for me, I really liked this one. But again, check those trigger warnings because there is a lot that goes on in this book that can be quite sad. And then the next book on my list, coming in spot number 4, is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. This one actually reminds me a lot of A Little Life. I read Tomorrow, Tomorrow and Tomorrow first, and then I read A Little Life, and they kind of, I feel like, are very similar in the ways that they're both following, they go between different characters, but I would say mainly both following like a primary male main character who just has a lot of hardships in their lives. And both of them have all kinds of issues that they go through with depression and things like that, but it's both books kind of just cover the entirety of their lives. And so I thought that was very interesting, that they were very similar, but they're also completely different stories. And I'd highly recommend both of these books. I really just enjoy books like that where it goes through the entirety of someone's lives, and these were a couple of the top books of that genre for me this year. Okay, and now on to my top 3 books that I actually pretty much have with me, actually have my own copies or a library copy. So in number 3 is well, specifically what is in number 3 for me is Crown of Midnight, and that is the either second or third Throne of Glass book, depending on how you read the series. So you might recognize Sarah J. Maas if you're not familiar with the Throne of Glass series. She's also the one who wrote the series, A Court of Thorn and Roses series, which has been a very big trending series. This is the series that I believe she wrote all of the books before the ACOTAR series. I could be wrong in that. But there are, I think, 8 books in this series. I'm slowly working on collecting all 8 books because I have really fallen in love with the series in the very end of 2023. And so since I know I love the series, while I usually don't buy books, I have been buying / asking for all of these ones for Christmas because I have just loved them so much. So I still haven't actually gotten Crown of Midnight yet, which is what is in my number 3 spot. But it's kind of just a spot holder for all of Throne of Glass in general. Just a little brief recap or brief summary. This is, these books primarily follow Selena Sardothian, who is a trained assassin, and in the Throne of Glass book, she's kind of put up against these other assassins to fight to be the king's assassin, where she will assassinate people for the king and then eventually be able to earn her freedom. Because she starts out as a slave in the beginning of this book. But yeah, so far I've read 4 of the books, I believe. I've read Assassin's Blade, which is kind of the prequel that people read in a different order. I read Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, and then Heir of Fire. And for sure, Crown of Midnight has been my favorite just because of some of the twists that happened in that book that I was totally not expecting, and just some of the best twists that I have ever read in a book. But in general, I've been loving this series, so I would totally recommend it, especially if you're someone that wants to try out fantasy, but maybe you're a little bit uncomfortable with fantasy. Maybe you tried reading fantasy in the past that just had like way too much world building and different types of things you had to learn. Throne of Glass has that, but I would say they kind of get you into it slowly, because when these books first start out, magic has been outlawed, so there isn't really a magic element, even though it's a fantasy book. And then I don't think it's really a spoiler to say magic will come into play at some point, but I think it kind of gets you there slowly, so you're kind of already like pulled into the characters and the story before there's those elements, so you know what's happening more, and it was a bit less overwhelming. Yes, I highly recommend this series. Definitely my favorite series of 2023 that I read. Then number 2 on my top 10 books of 2023 is Demon Copperhead. And this is one that I haven't talked about on my channel yet because I actually just finished reading it at the end of December. This was my final book of 2023 and number 2 on my top 10 books of the year. So definitely went out of 2023 with a bang. This one it follows the life of a boy who grows up in like rural, I think it's Virginia. I don't know if they clarify Virginia or just like Appalachian Mountains. I'm pretty sure it's Virginia. So yeah, he grows up in rural Virginia, in this community that basically no kids are set up for success. You have so many different people on drugs, no one's really going to college. That's not the expectation. That's just like some unheard of thing. Most people are going to go to high school, probably drop out of high school, get some type of blue-collar job, or not even be able to hold a job. So it's just kind of covering his life of growing up in this community, and I think it's really eye-opening and brings up topics that you would not necessarily have thought of before about how, I think it's easy as someone who has grown up more privileged to think like, oh, why can't you just like get it together, and like, yeah, you grew up with these hardships, but yeah, go to school, get your education, and then you can get a good job. But like, there's so many challenges that you don't even think of, that I think this book did a really great job of covering, and it was just so well written. I would 100% recommend it. Okay, and now on to my number 1 book of 2023. Drumroll. My number 1 book of 2023 was The Heart's Invisible Furies. And this is one that I read before I had my YouTube channel. I think I did talk about it, or I'm sure I did talk about it in my 5-star reads of all time. This one I really loved, and I think it's my top read because even though some of these other books are also very good books and maybe hard to compare in some ways and really decide, I feel like this one just stands out to me. I think about this book so often for no reason. Like, I just randomly think about this book. This covers a boy that grows up in Ireland, and he is always kind of a bit of a weird kid, doesn't really know why he's the weird kid, and then eventually discovers that he is gay. But this takes place in, I'm not exactly sure when, sometime early 1900s maybe? It was probably even later than that. I think it was like mid 1900s. But being gay in very Catholic Ireland is so not okay. And so he just has this insanely difficult life. And it's so sad, but also so uplifting at times. And I just really loved this book. I think another big reason that this was such a favorite book for me in 2023 was that it really surprised me. I think I fall into the trap a lot, and I'll talk about this a bit later when I talk about my goals for 2024, of like, I see a book, I check the Goodreads reviews. If it's below a 4, I usually don't read it. If it's above a 4, I read it and have these very high expectations for the book. This one, I was actually in Ireland this past, so like a year ago from September, and we went into this random bookstore and I found this book there for very cheap, and I don't know if I even looked it up first or if I was just like, oh, I think I've heard that name before. And then I read it and it just like really blew me away with how insanely good this book is. And again, another one of those books, I feel like half the books on my top 10 book list are ones that just follow someone's complete life. But I just feel like that allows me to get so connected to the main character, and you just go through so much with them. You're just so connected. So yeah, highly recommend this book. I loved it. Think about it all the time. Can't talk about it enough. And really all the books on this list, especially like the ones that are on the first half of this top 10 list, are just books that I will always think about, always love so much. Just can't recommend them enough. Okay, so yeah, that wraps up my top 10 books of 2023. The last little part of this video, I wanted to talk about my goals for 2024, kind of just looking towards the future of this next year. First thing I'll say is the top thing to address in the 2024 booktube video is what my Goodreads goal has been set at. And I've set my Goodreads goal for 75 books. So I debated this a lot. This past year, as I mentioned, I read 94 books. And so part of me was a little tempted to just like shoot for 100, see if I could reach it. Because I think I did start reading a lot more the second half of 2023, so I was like, I feel like that's kind of doable if I just like really get started fast in the beginning of 2024. However, at the end of the day, I don't want it to be a stressful experience trying to get through a lot of books. I want to read books to enjoy them. And so I don't want to put too much pressure on it. I want to put a little bit of pressure on myself because sometimes it's easy to just fall into looking at your phone and not picking up a book. But I know that if I pick up a book, I'll enjoy myself way more. So I want to have enough pressure that I do pick up the book, but not enough pressure that once I pick up the book, I'm like trying to read it so fast because I want to just get to the next one and reach my goal. So with that said, a few other goals I have is to, aligning with that, put less pressure on the number of books that I'm reading per month. I think especially since I started making YouTube videos, I have in my head that like I need to try and get to about 10 books a month because that's a good number for me to have in YouTube videos, and I don't want it to be like just a few books that I talk about in a video. But if I am reading books I really enjoy, it really shouldn't matter. So putting less pressure on that overall. But at the same time, trying to even more replace my phone time with reading time. Looking at my like weekly phone usage, I think I could still greatly reduce the time I'm on my phone and change that into reading time. Another one of the top kind of goals on my 2024 list is to read more of the books on my bookshelf. So as I'm hoping to do a video on very shortly, I have in the year of 2023 really discovered library book sales, and I'll talk about these more in that video, but basically you can get books for super cheap, as in like 50 cents to $1 at these library book sales. Some of them are perfectly new unread books. Some of them have been read but are still in great condition, and you get them for so cheap. So I've become addicted. I have bought a very crazy number of books in the year of 2023, and I will show those all in that video. And even though I bought that many books, I've actually read a couple of them, and that's because prior to buying these books, I didn't want to spend the money on buying new books all the time, so I am a very avid library user. So even though I was getting all these books at book sales, I had so many books reserved at the library, and so I couldn't really get to the ones I was buying because a book would be ready for me and then it would be due and then I would reserve more for some reason, and I was just having this issue of I constantly had books I need to read from the library, and so I didn't get to a lot of the ones that I have on my bookshelf. So my goal in 2024, I haven't reserved any new books from the library except for audiobooks, so I'm hoping to really just get to those books I have on my shelf, because there's a lot of really great books that I am very excited to get to, and it will also be really nice to not have to return them. It'll make it way easier to film videos, so it really just great all around. So hopefully I will get into that more in 2024. And then my last goal for 2024 that I think I alluded to earlier is I want to be a little bit better at just like going blind into books and just seeing how I feel about them. I think I get very worried about like wasting my time on a bad book. So I will just look up, as I mentioned before, I'll look up reviews. If it's below 4 stars, I probably won't read it unless I hear a ton of people talking about it and saying how good it is, and then I'll give it a try. And most of the time I think this does work out well for me. I pretty rarely have super low rated books because I feel like I vet them pretty well. I know what I like, I see if they have good reviews on Goodreads, and usually I either enjoy them an average amount or I really love them. But I think, for example, when I was talking about like The Heart's Invisible Furies, this is a book that I would not, I don't know, just based off the cover, I wouldn't necessarily have picked it up. If I looked at Goodreads reviews, I actually probably would have, because it did have great reviews, but there was something about the just like picking it up randomly and then loving it that made me enjoy it even more. So I want to be a little better at doing that, especially when I go to these library book sales that have such cheap books. Why not just pick out a few without looking at the reviews and try them out, and then maybe I'll love them and I'll like really be surprised by it and really feel like I formed my own opinion of the book. So yeah, those are just some personal goals going forward into this year, but I hope that all of you had a great year of reading in 2023, and I hope you all have a great year of reading in 2024. Definitely check out some of these top 10 books if you're looking for some book recs to start out your reading year. These are amazing books that I obviously highly recommend. And with that, I'll see you in my next video.